King Cambo, 100 proof, bringing you nothing but the truth. You're drowning, a vanport, the death of a city too. The death of a city too black for Oregon. Sadly, many of the horrors in American history stink of racism. Many of the words of America today stink of racism. There's a ugliness in American history that few like to talk about. Stories from the past that resemble a horror movie more than they do the building of a nation. Sadly, many of the horrors in American history stink of racism. In the latest installment of Black Folklore, we dive into the story of the 1948 drowning of Vanport, Oregon. Once the second largest city in the state, Vanport was founded because of racism and then destroyed because of racism. Oregon is one of the whitest states in America. Only 2% of the entire state is black, well below the national average of around 13%. Portland, the biggest city in the state, is 6% black. This is no coincidence. On September 21st, 1849, Oregon Territory's legislature enacted a law that prohibited blacks from entering the state. Fuck Oregon. The law specified that it should not be lawful for any Negro or mulatto to enter the state or reside in Oregon at the end of the Oregon Trail, with exception made for those who were already in the territory. Although slavery was outlawed in Oregon on the 7th, 1857, 4 years before the Civil War would begin, racism still had its grips on white minds. In the same vote, voters disapproved of slavery by the wide margin, but voted for exclusion clauses that once again banned blacks in entering and living in the state, owning property in the state, and making contracts for business in Oregon. Whites feared that blacks would intermix with Indians, instilling into their minds feelings of hostility towards the white race, guilt parties. As a result, Oregon would become the only free state admitted to the Union that banned blacks. It was not repealed by voters until 1926. Get the fuck out of here. Fuck Oregon. Oregon was successful in its strategy and strategically creating a white utopian state, but that would all change once World War II rolled in. White men began getting drafted by droves to fight overseas, which created a labor shortage in the country, still developing its infrastructure. During the Great Migration, blacks saw this as an opportunity to create a better life for themselves and their families by migrating to the Northwest. Portland became the ideal location for blacks seeking employment during wartime America. Black men and women began arriving in Portland by the thousands. By the early 1940s, Portland's black population exploded into cities. Officials suddenly had a housing crisis on their hands due to redlining. Blacks were only legally allowed to live in the Albina neighborhood of the city. But there just wasn't enough space to fit Portland's booming black population. City officials needed a way to fix the housing shortage, but also make sure to keep their discriminatory housing policies intact. One thing they didn't want was to make black families too comfortable. Then they might not leave after the war was over. The establishment white way of life had to be protected, and whites did not want blacks to stay in their neighborhood permanently. Portland can absorb only a minimum amount of Negroes without upsetting the city's regular life, said the city mayor. The city eventually built 4,900 temporary houses units and some 120,000 new workers, but it wasn't nearly enough. Industrialist and owner, Oregon Shipbuilder Corporation, Henry Kaiser, needed the process to needed the process to move faster at shipyard, needing workers immediately. So in 1943, he decided to build a temporary housing project in the Columbia River. The haphazard city of Vanport was completed in the 110 days with a system of dikes as the only protection with the massive river. The town, which was built on marshlands, had 10,000 apartments and homes and was physically separated from Portland by the Columbia Slough. The homes were cheaply made from wooden blocks and fiberboard walls and provided little comfort for privacy for anyone living in them. But this didn't stop eager blacks and whites from moving in. For many Americans, the opportunity meant consistent work and means to a better way of life. Vanport quickly grew into the second largest city in Oregon, rivaling the neighboring Portland. It was also the largest housing project in the country. It peaked at its homes at 40,000 workers. More than 6,000 of them were black. But everything would change in Vanport in 1948. A snowy winter mixed with warm and rainy spring caused the Columbia River to reach dangerous heights. On May 25, 1948, the river had reached 23 feet, 8 feet above the flood stage level. City officials began monitoring the dikes, but didn't issue a single warning to the residents. Instead, the Housing Authority of Portland and the United States Army Corps of Engineers told residents the city needed not worry about the flooding because the dikes were not in jeopardy of collapsing. But this was a lie. While reassuring Vanport residents and the city of safe, the Housing Authority of Portland secretly removed files and equipment from their offices in the city and also relocated 600 horses from a nearby racetrack. On the morning of May 3rd, 1948, the Housing Authority sent flyers to the residents of Vanport, once again affirming the dikes were safe. By 4:17 p.m., the dikes began to give way. It wasn't the first time, in Louisiana. At first, it was just a crack about 6 feet wide. The crack rapidly expanded, and therefore residents even knew that it was happening. The crack had grown to about 500-foot gap in the dike. Thousands of homes were washed away in the blink of an eye. Within 10 minutes, the entire city was gone. Destruction and devastation, the only thing left. There was no warning from law enforcement. The city officials and the residents lost everything. Hundreds of innocent people lost their lives. If it wasn't for the students and the faculty from Vanport College alerting the residents that the flood waters were on their way, many more would have died. 18,500 residents were displaced, and roughly 6,300 were black. Vanport could have been saved if white people wanted it to be. It's hard to believe that this was the plan for Vanport all along. Temporary housing built on top of marshlands, building materials that weren't worth a damn. Vanport was never intended to succeed. It was just a scheme, way to use blacks for their labor and to let nature dispose of them so whites wouldn't have to do it. Today, like so many other drowned black towns, Vanport was being replaced with beauty so that white people in Portland do not have to be reminded of the racist ancestors. What was once a booming city with so much promise for black residents is now a park with golf courses, baseball fields, and lush greenery. The only thing there to remind you of the horrors from the past is a plaque, barely visible to the naked eye. It means, who wants to be reminded of their ancestors' racism and bigotry while they're taking a morning jog in Delta Park? This is King Camboof, getting my music cut off in the middle of recording it by the fuck powers that be, the same powers that flooded this town. King Camboof, 100 proof, bringing you nothing but the racist truth.